Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the next webinar in the Geothermal Collegiate Competition webinar series. Today, we are joined again by Aaron Levine, who serves as the Senior Legal and Regulatory Analyst in the National Renewable Energy Lab's Strategic Energy Analysis Center. Generally, Mr. Levine focuses on legal, regulatory, and policy issues related to geothermal, hydropower, solar, wind, transmission, alternative fuels, and other energy-related matters. Mr. Levine has specialized expertise in energy facility siting and transmission regulation. He holds an LLM from the University of Denver Sturm College of Law and a JD from the University of Kansas School of Law. Mr. Levine is a Colorado licensed attorney and previously served as chair of the American Bar Association's Renewable Alternative and Distributed Energy Resources Committee from 2017 until 2019. Mr. Levine's here today to talk to us about GeoRePORT, which is a system, and the system is a resource and project assessment tool used to measure potential and guide development in the geothermal sector. This tool was developed at NREL, and Mr. Levine was one of the leading authors on this program. It was developed originally for the Department of Energy's Geothermal Technologies Office, but it's applicable worldwide. The methodology assesses three categories of the geothermal project development: geological, technical, and socioeconomic. Today's talk will be focused on the socioeconomic tool and the recent updates that have been made to allow for looking at direct use and heat in addition to power. So thank you so much for joining us today, Aaron. I will hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Katie, and thanks everyone for joining us again this week. As Katie mentioned, I'll be going over the GeoRePORT SEAT tool, our socioeconomic assessment tool. This is a tool that I originally led the development of roughly 5 to 6 years ago. And as Katie mentioned, we are currently updating and releasing a version 2 this spring, focused on adding direct use attributes to what was previously a power sector tool. So to begin, just walking through a background of GeoRePORT itself and what it is. So the tool was initially developed to help DOE's Geothermal Technologies Office track and measure project progress, the impact of geothermal research and development funding, and as a communication tool with stakeholders, particularly trying to take what can be very complex and granular information and raise it to a level that can be understood by a variety of different stakeholders across a number of both technical and socioeconomic areas. So initially, the tool was developed by NREL and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, LBNL, specifically focused on the geological and technical assessment tools, whereas the socioeconomic tool was developed solely at NREL. It's generally designed for geothermal experts to input the information, and by expert, we're using that term broadly, but generally those with some level of expertise, including our Geothermal Collegiate Competition students, whereas the audience is really based for non-technical stakeholders. And so the goal is to try to be able to input data to then export results that are more broadly understood and able to be communicated across a variety of audiences. One of the keys to GeoRePORT is it does help provide this uniform assessment criteria for grading and going through project development phases. This helps to provide consistency in reporting. However, it's not a replacement for consultants, conceptual or reservoir models, or other geothermal expertise. It is generally can be used by those type of stakeholders. However, I would not advise that this tool in and of itself should be used in lieu of them. Obviously, in a student competition, I think we're in a different space than that. And so I think this is a great tool to apply in the competition. So just at a high level, kind of walking through what GeoRePORT is and how it portrays results. So you can see here with the green, blue, and red colors, we have the three tools within the GeoRePORT toolkit. we'll be focusing on this green area. You can see that it's the 4 areas or sub-attributes that we've developed, attributes within, and then sub-attributes for socioeconomic include permitting and land access, transmission, and market conditions. One thing we'll be adding to this for direct use applications is distribution, which can be used in lieu of transmission, and really focusing more on the distribution of and the piping of the heat as opposed to traditional electric transmission. It's worth noting that we developed this with heavy input from industry. When I led the socioeconomic tool, we had a advisory group of roughly 10 to 15 geothermal experts across regulatory agencies at the state and federal level, consulting firms, developers, trade association representatives. So we really got a lot of in-depth input and review as we developed the tool. The tools are available for download at our GeoRePORT website. I would note that we envision releasing the version 2 of the seat within the next month. And so while the 4 areas within the 4 attributes within this seat are applicable and unchanged in the new version, this new version will add that distribution category for those of you who are looking to grade out a direct use project. So just at a high level in terms of the methodology behind GeoRePORT and particularly around this resource grade, which is what we're going to focus on today. The resource grade is really focused on understanding kind of what potential challenges or how favorable for development a specific geothermal reservoir could be. And so when focusing on these categories, the attributes within the seat, we're talking about grading out different aspects of accessing the land and the type of resources that might be on that land, the permitting process, the market conditions, and then the transmission or distribution conditions relevant to the site. All of these are generally graded A through E, A being the most favorable with E being the least favorable. And then we have built into the tool itself a number of various weightings across the different attributes and sub-attributes that then output into this rows diagram and provide a high-level grade across, say, a series of 5 or 6 different sub-attributes or different resources we're looking at within land access. I guess one thing worth noting, some of the tools within GeoRePORT use an execution index, which is really geared at how well the activity was executed. That applies only to the geologic and technical assessment tools. That is really based off of, say, the type of exploration techniques or how the data was collected. When we're looking at this socioeconomic area, we've not included an execution index, assuming that there is not greater or less in terms of how that information is obtained as there would be with subsurface data collection. We do use an activities index, and this is really focused on kind of the phase of the project you're at, whether that be early stage exploration, well drilling, power plant development. These things, they all factor into what can be known and understood at that time. And so certainly the further along you are in a project, the more certainty you have and the further along you are in this activity index. So we also have this kind of project readiness level. This speaks again to kind of just moving along in the project. I don't know how applicable this will be to the Geothermal Collegiate Competition, since most of your work is going to be more in the abstract anyways. You're not a project developer on site actually getting to the point where you've received a PUC approval in a project. So I wanted to highlight this, but also make you aware that for your purposes, this is going to be something that you likely create the scenario yourself, and it won't be as applicable to your work. So when applying GeoRePORT, On the website, we have a spreadsheet tool. It's Excel-based that allows you to go in and input your grades around each of the attributes and sub-attributes. So generally, the way I advise people to use the tool is to look at the protocol document, as we call it, which is a more or less how-to guide explaining the attributes, sub-attributes, what to be considering and what they're really focused on. And then you use the tool itself to input the grades. This will provide you then with that weighted output. And so within the tool, there are tabs along the bottom. For the socioeconomic, it's the green tabs. You can kind of see here at the end is where it would be starting. And so you would go in within those tabs. You can see here within the geologic and technical summaries that ultimately you go into each of the attributes and plug in the grades across the sub-attributes. But then at the high level, at the tech summary, geo summary, and this would be the socioeconomic summary, it provides you with that high level output that was shown in that rose diagram at the beginning of the presentation, and gives you that overall picture of the project. So moving into the seat itself, I'm going to begin by walking through our land access category. Today, I'm going to focus on our land access and our permitting categories for this presentation. I think that it's going to be generally what's most applicable to you for this competition and looking at the permits required and the environmental impacts. I'm not certain that there's much involved with the project in terms of looking at specific market conditions, transmission infrastructure in place, or distribution infrastructure. But again, we do have those tools that are applied in much the same way that the two I'm going to walk through today. But these two, based off of the rules we created for the competition, seem most applicable. So at a high level, just providing kind of an overview of the land access category. Understanding the challenges to accessing land is important for geothermal development. There's lots of environmental studies, public and private aspects of land ownership and leasing that come into play. Studies that we've completed here in the past at NREL show that the presence of certain resources and different types of land use could cause projects to be delayed by potentially several years. Particularly, this can be the case with, say, endangered species, sensitive cultural resources, and other aspects that could be found at the project. So within this attribute, as we call it, this category of land access, we have 6 sub-attributes or subcategories that contribute to develop this land access grade. And I'm going to walk through each of these individually and provide a little background of why they're important. But generally, these include cultural and tribal resources, environmentally sensitive areas, biological resources, land ownership, federal and state lease queues to obtain leases, and then proximity to military installations. So beginning with the land access section, as you see, all these will be structured similarly. I'll walk through the grades A through E. Tribal and cultural resources can be a challenge to geothermal development, particularly since one, we have a subsurface resource, and so the potential to come across buried artifacts is certainly relevant. But also, traditionally, hot springs have had cultural and tribal significance in this country, and so there's certainly aspects within just the nature of geothermal resources and hot springs that come into play. We've seen through past research that tribal concerns, particularly significant tribal involvement in public comment and having input into a project, can extend and lengthen timelines, sometimes by maybe a year or so. And so when going through this, we really walked through kind of from an A to E, what are the most favorable to least favorable conditions around developing a geothermal resource when it comes to tribal and cultural resources. And so as you can see, A is, there's no known tribal or cultural resources. The State Historic Preservation Office concurs. Maybe it's a 2 to 3 month review and you move on, and it doesn't really have much of an impact on the timeline. Whereas at the, I think, other end of that spectrum is the extreme cultural resource complication. So maybe that is a very significant hot spring, a known tribal burial ground, or a known area of other tribal or cultural artifacts. something that could require detailed cultural resource surveys, potentially take a year to two for the Bureau of Land Management if it's on federal land, and working with a SHPO or a SHPO on its own within, say, state or private lands within a state, taking a year or two to complete that review. And so everything kind of in between there falls within this range of, 4 months, 6 to 9 months, roughly a year. And these kind of are in correspondence to the type of the significance of the resource impact. One thing I'll note within tribal and cultural resources is at a desktop review level, it is very challenging to actually obtain detailed information in this area. SHPOs, the State Historic Preservation Offices, and other tribal historic preservation personnel are very sensitive about what can be revealed in terms of the location of known cultural and tribal resources. A lot of times when developers are working in this space, it's a lot of, we want to drill here. Well, no, you can't. Pick another spot without them going into detail on the resources. A lot of this is due to just protection of the resource themselves and not making that publicly available. Generally, what we've been able to do is, as a kind of a guide, is look to where there's known tribal boundaries and kind of a buffer around those, assuming that where tribes have historically been located in those nearby areas might have the highest level of potential for significant tribal and cultural impacts. Moving on to our second sub-attribute. So this one's focused more generally on environmentally sensitive areas. And when we refer to these, we're talking about things like wetlands that might fall under waters of the United States, wildlife refuges, national parks, which are excluded from development of geothermal resources, and other areas at the state or federal level that might be protected and could complicate or prevent development. Again, similar to the structure of our first sub-attribute, you'll see that an A grade is it's not located in an environmentally sensitive area. At most, this is maybe a 2 to 3 month review to verify. Generally, it can even be less than that. Whereas the E brings us to these extremely environmentally sensitive areas. So national parks or monuments that might be completely off limits, or wilderness study areas, private conservation land. These are issues that are either not likely to be resolved at all, and you're going to have to pick another location, or in some cases, if you can resolve them, they might take years to really go through and develop. In between, you generally have some of these more manageable environmentally sensitive areas. C, for example, with waters of the US, you have generally something that might take 6 months to a year to really delineate whether the area is within the waters of the United States, and if so, the permitting approvals and water quality certifications associated with that. Other areas, in this D category, such as wild and scenic rivers or refuges or some preserves, may be able to be developed in, but again, you're looking at these taking maybe a year or two or longer to come to a resolution, certainly making project development more difficult. Our third attribute within this category is our biological resources. So generally, we're looking to issues with endangered species, migratory birds, bald and golden eagles, other protected species or species that are sensitive enough where protections have been put in place absent a federal statute protecting them. And I think the prime example of that has been sage grouse in the Western United States. Again, similar structure where we have no biological resource issues present through what we included here, actually, which has been one of the most difficult, is sage grouse primary habitat focal areas. And so when you have these PHMA areas, generally development has been off limits within them based off of agreements that have been made by various federal and state agencies developing landscape level plans around sage grouse habitat. In between, you have another number of these other issues. One thing that I would say is that C is a good example of, even though where you do have threatened endangered species, migratory birds, bald and golden eagles, there is still the potential to develop at these sites. And in the case, for example, of Endangered Species Act, a federal agency, say if the BLM is administering this project, would consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service. If the project's on state or private land, the developer themselves would likely be consulting with Fish and Wildlife Service under a similar but separate process. And this really allows you to get a take permit or a take statement that discusses the impacts and allows some impact to these areas. So I would caution that just the presence of endangered species alone is not a project inhibitor so much as it's something that could take more in this kind of 6 to 12 month range. Another key aspect of this, and maybe more central to land access itself, is just land ownership. We've graded this out, really focused on federal, state, and private land, and the potential that in a number of cases, projects could have multiple owners. This might be multiple surface owners. It could be a surface owner that is distinct from a subsurface owner. It is one of the challenges, I think, with geothermal resource development, that you see the potential for these split estates where the mineral or geothermal rights might have one owner, the surface rights might have a separate owner. In other cases, we see it where there might be separate surface owners. Maybe your power plant is actually being developed on state or private land, but it's using a resource that's on federal land, and maybe even has distribution piping going over federal land. So a lot of these issues can raise complications in terms of just the number of players involved in approving land access, improving utilization of the resource itself. We've structured this where a private land single owner would be likely the most straightforward in terms of reaching agreement. Private land with multiple owners and split estates, so potentially different surface and subsurface owners, can start to create more complications. And as you move down through this list, you start to get to different federal owners and state owners and combinations thereof and challenges associated with that. Next is something, it's a concept called the lease queue. And so this likely occurs more on federal land than state land in some cases. It really depends on the lease structure of that state. On federal land, in most cases, a geothermal developer nominates a parcel they would like to develop. Or in some cases, if the parcel is known by the BLM or Forest Service, they can work together, and then the BLM can nominate that parcel on its own and place it up for leasing. But prior to issuing that lease for competitive solicitation, it has to complete some environmental review processes. And so in some cases, we've seen in the past where on federal land, particularly on Forest Service managed land, that lease queue might have a number of other projects in it that have to complete that environmental analysis prior to the parcel you're looking at. And so we've seen in cases where this can take greater than 5 years if you're towards the end of that lease queue. And we've had a couple times throughout history, most notably probably in after 2005 with the passage of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, where we saw a lot of federal funds go to clear out a very long lease queue. But when those funds get depleted and then the lease queue starts to build up, sometimes there's not resources at the agency level without appropriations from Congress directed to that activity to process the queue in an expedited fashion. And so that can result in sometimes waiting years to be able to even bid on the lease for the parcel. And then finally, with this in this category, looking at proximity to military installations, this is a concern not just for geothermal projects, but comes up within a lot of different infrastructure development type with sensitivities from various branches of the military, whether it's something associated with a base, with runways, with missile testing ranges. There's lots of issues that can arise from being close to a military installation. And so within this, we have it, from A being not located near a military installation to E being negatively impacting a military installation. And likely when you get to E is where you'd see a project potentially being prevented. If there's concerns that there might be impacts to runways, if there might be other impacts associated with military operations at the installation itself, you you would likely be unable to develop that project. However, that doesn't mean that you can't develop any project on a military installation. It just means that it's going to be more challenging. And then certainly, even when you get within certain proximity distances, it might be a little more challenging. There might be certain concerns about, what activities is the military doing on that base, and do they have any concerns with nearby activities impacting that. So that was a high-level overview of our land access attribute. With that, I'll now be moving into our permitting attribute. And so again, at the overview level, there's a variety of different permits that are required in developing geothermal resources. These really vary from state to state. There's various federal, state, and local authorities whose authority can be triggered under a number of different circumstances. That local authority might have some permitting approvals that they issue. Those could vary from things as simple as land grading and building to, in some cases, local authorities actually have the ability to approve drilling of wells for exploration or development, and even power plant approvals. A lot of those also occur at the state level when the project is on state or private land. And then at the federal level, predominantly those occur where federal land is impacted. And so whether that is the BLM as the administrator of geothermal rights as a mineral right, or surface access for rights of ways for piping, other types of distribution or transmission line development, power plant siting. Within this attribute, we've defined 3 sub-attributes. One is the regulatory framework at the state and federal level. 2 is the environmental review process, the regulatory process that has to be completed prior to permits being issued. And then 3rd is this category called ancillary permits, which I'll get into, which is generally the permits that are required outside of those specifically for exploring and drilling and utilizing the resource. These might be for air quality, water quality, and other types of permit approvals required to develop the project. So the regulatory framework, at a high level, we're talking about the types of issues of, is there a lack of experience by the regulatory personnel? Is there a lack of interagency coordination between different agencies that are going to have to be involved in the project at that state? At the federal level, we're really focused on the knowledge of the permitting experts and knowledge of the regional staff. So for example, if you're in an area of the BLM, where maybe that district office has had a lot of experience developing geothermal resources, say in areas of Nevada, or if you're in an individual national forest that's had similar experience compared to maybe you're in an area of New Mexico or Idaho that's had little experience and doesn't have the same level of staff expertise, and that can create challenges when going through the permitting process. In some cases, the regional office or state office might have an MOU with the state to coordinate the roles of the state and federal agencies and what those are in the project. That can certainly be beneficial and help improve timelines and performance compared to where some of those issues have not been worked out and previously discussed, and they're really learned on the fly through the project itself. At the state level, we really focus on the sophistication of that state in terms of how defined are their regulations, as well as their knowledge within the state for geothermal development. Certainly states like Nevada and California, even Hawaii, have had more experience with developing geothermal resources than some other states. And so that sometimes creates challenges and confusions and consideration of issues for the first time at the state level that can prolong the process. So here, this is kind of busy on this slide. And again, this is all in the protocol document itself. But when focused on this regulatory framework, at the federal level, we're really talking about, the best areas being areas where the BLM has permitting experience with geothermal exploration and development. They have an MOU with the state, so the roles are well defined and understood. Down to E being, maybe there's no geothermal staff or even funding to support geothermal staff in the local area. And this can certainly create challenges. Going through this, maybe there's areas that they have experience, but they don't have an MOU with the state. So that's not always as streamlined as it could be, or maybe there's areas without permitting experience, but they do have some staff there to support it. and so on. At the state level, we're really focused on, kind of the best being is there's some sort of permit coordinating office or some sort of coordination that occurs between the various state agencies involved. Do they have geothermal regulations and experience successfully permitting projects? Something you may notice is that there are some eastern states, if you're looking in eastern states, that don't have well-defined geothermal regulations and processes in place. Certainly that's going to create more of a challenge than an area that has well-defined geothermal regulations and experience permitting projects. And so that's kind of the gamut that we run from A to E here, looking at those who have successfully permitted it with well-defined regulations and coordinating procedures, all the way down through where there's no regulations at all, and kind of the various steps in between there. On the environmental review subattribute, here we're really focused on federal and state environmental review processes. So for example, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a federal process that anytime more or less a federal agency has to make a discretionary decision, so whether that's a decision to fund a project, a decision to permit a project, etc., they have to complete some level of environmental review. That environmental review may be very simple, particularly if there's been previous environmental reviews completed at the site itself, or if a categorical exclusion may apply. But it also might require a 1 to 2 or more year process to go through and study impacts and define mitigation measures and potentially even go to the extent of environmental impact statements saying that there are unmitigable impacts at the project. We've generally kind of broken this down to A being, the project isn't subject to an environmental review, and then working our way down through. So at the B level, maybe there's one federal or state environmental review. At the C level, maybe there's a couple of them. So this could be required, for example, if you're in California and there's both a federal and state component, and you have to complete the California Environmental Quality Act as well as the NEPA process. And so that can certainly create challenges in itself, even if they don't find significant impacts just from going through multiple environmental review processes at the same time. Once we get into the D category, we're really focused on, is there a significant impact on the environment? And so that's when we talk about these environmental impact statements. At the state level, they might be called an environmental impact report. But these are more elongated processes, generally taking a couple years to complete, if not longer. There's more public involvement, there's more in-depth study requirements. And then E would be the scenario where you have multiple of these processes with significant environmental impacts, and that's likely the longest timeline scenario you would see in this space. Next, looking at the ancillary permitting process. And so when we talk about ancillary permits, again, I'm referring to the ones outside of kind of the specific geothermal exploration, well field drilling type of permits or utilization permits on federal land. These are things like the air quality, water quality, waste disposal, public utility commission approvals, and siting processes that are broad in nature. Generally, we've defined this in fairly simple terms in terms of just the number of permits required outside of those core geothermal permits. Kind of ranging from less than 4 to greater than 10, with the assumption being that the more permitting processes you have to go to, the more data that has to be collected, the more agencies you have to work with, that will likely result in greater challenges to developing the project and extend your timelines. So with that, I'll hold here and we can take any questions on the seat or any of the attributes and sub-attributes I've covered today. Again, it's worth noting that if it's applicable to your project, we do have these market condition sections and the transmission, and soon to have the distribution sections. Those are really focused on some of the, maybe heat or electricity demand issues at the market level, access to transmission, any challenges specific to distribution of a direct use resource. And so as those are applicable, I'd encourage you to take a look at those sections of the seat as well. And again, those are also areas that can be graded out using the tool itself in the Excel spreadsheet. So with that, any questions we've received, Katie?
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. And just for everyone on the call, when the new version of the SEAT tool is released, we will be posting on HeroX, so you will get a notification of that at that time. We have not had any questions come into the chat yet. However, if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in there or come off mute and ask Aaron directly. Okay, well, oh, thanks, Kelly. So Kelly has dropped the HeroX page link into the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us directly. Kelly or Hannah, if one of you don't mind dropping our email into the chat as well, that would be great. I hope everyone found today's webinar useful. GeoRePORT's a great tool for you to use while you are working on your GCC project. And hopefully you can utilize the new tools that are coming out, the new versions of the SEAT. And thanks so much for your time, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And again, good luck with the competition. I look forward to seeing the results.
Yeah, and just a reminder for everyone, we do have the upcoming required progress submission that is due on actually a week from today, February 17th at 5 p.m. Eastern. So please make sure that if you are participating in the GCC that you get that in so that you are eligible to submit your final submission in April. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to call us, or I'm sorry, email us. Hannah has dropped our email in the chat, and there's also valuable information on the HeroX website. So thanks everyone so much for joining us, and have a great day.